Swami Vivekananda said that the life is short, the vanities of the world are transient, but they alone live who live for others. The rest are more dead than alive. He also said that after so much tapasya, I have known that the highest truth is this: He is present in every being. These are all in manifold form of Him. There is no other God to seek for. He alone is worshipping God who serves all beings. Swamiji had tremendous faith on youth. He said, my faith is in younger generation. The modern generation, out of them will come my workers. They will work out the whole problem like lions. Our subject for today's evening is precisely this. How can we as youth contribute to the welfare of our society and evolution of mankind into realizing their divinity? Man is essentially divine. Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Sri V. Srinivas. Sri V. Srinivas often is BTech from IIT Bombay and PGDM from IIT Ahmedabad. V. Srinivas has spent almost 20 years working on the question of knowledge and how it enables human society in ways that other research do not. For about 8 years, he was engaged in the formal craft of knowledge construction as co-founder and co-CEO of IISc. He's produced knowledge products in the area of industry research and information. Subsequently, he became engaged in the science of knowledge construction, that is, how are knowledge products and communications of consistently high standards and effectiveness created and delivered by the diversely gifted and motivated workers in a plural society. This work led to the profound realization that knowledge in itself is merely a resource, whether in the form of books, data, or even as recorded insight from those who knew. Knowledge to be truly useful and valuable must be living, alive in the hearts and minds of men who cope every day with challenges from a relentlessly transforming and demanding world. This has led to this present definition of knowledge construction as an emergent response to life's challenges. Sri Srinivas currently leads the team at Illumines Knowledge Resource, a design lab and consulting firm that set up design collectives in various institutes and community settings. His research focus of the last few years has been the transformation of the modern workplace into an arena for personal and social evolution. This work done in Illumines Design Lab is being implemented in large-scale initiatives that include citizenship development, community empowerment, mindset transformation, and that reach out to lakhs of people in India. He also founded the I Become initiative, which is built on the basis premises that the transformation and contribution and fulfillment of mankind. I now request Sri V. Srinivas to address the audience. I'm sorry, I am mistaken. Sri V. Srinivas often is PGDM from IIM Ahmedabad. I was mistaken.
First of all, my pranams to Mother. And thank you for the organizers of this program for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure and always an honor to go back to IIT, and whether IIT Bombay, my alma mater, or any of the other IITs, and to share whatever one can with the people there. So today's conversation that we will have is about how we become contributors. This looks like a very obvious thing to become, a contributor, in the sense someone who contributes in whatever way. At the lowest level it might be material contributions, at the next level it might be intellectual contributions, and even higher level it is spiritual contributions. So that's one way of looking at the whole area of contribution. But truly, if you look around our society, to start kind of, making sense of what is going on. Here are some stories which I will share with you. So let me begin with a story of something that happened today afternoon. So I had to take the flight from Bombay to Chennai. So I'm told in the morning that the flight will be delayed. Last evening, late last night, that the flight will be delayed by 2 hours. So I go to the airport and I share, and when we are there in front of the lady who's at the counter, I tell her that, look, there is this talk in which I have to give, and I don't want to be late for it. So can you do me a small favor? Can you just put my luggage on priority so that it should not happen that in case the flight is late, every minute will matter. So can you do me this favor? She says, but sir, that costs 500 rupees. I said, I know it costs 500 rupees, but my question to you is that who has delayed the flight? You have delayed the flight. I had booked it for 11 o'clock so that I would account for all this. But you are the person who's shifted it to 2 o'clock. She looks at me blankly. She said, no sir, the rule is 500 rupees. So I said that, then she looks at me, suddenly it gives her, she said, but why did you reschedule the flight? I said, good point, it was last night. And then she said, you should have gone at 6 in the morning. I said, why should I get up at 4 in the morning, drive to the airport and catch a 6 o'clock flight? Why can't you just give me a simple priority tag? She said, no sir, that is not the rule. Would you call her a contributor? Just think about it. In one stroke, she has done so much damage to the reputation of that company. Now, if you asked her, she was doing her job. She said, I'm following the rules. I am doing what I have been asked to do by people. So there are occasions where you are supposed to do what you were asked to do, but you may not be contributing. So this is an example of how working is different from contributing. Let me give you another example. There's an old pensioner who walks into a bank. All these are true stories. Old pensioner walks into the bank. He's waiting in the line for a long time. He wants to know whether the money has come or not. Because for him that, when the money arrives and how he spends his money is important. So days matter for him. So he goes there and he's also anxious. He's a little anxious given his age and everything. So he goes there to the counter and he says, can you help me and tell me whether the money has arrived in my account? Can you please check my passbook? So it goes for a simple thing like a passbook updation. The person behind the counter says, computer not working, come again tomorrow. From the point of view of the person who is given this response, he or she is absolutely right. The computer is not working, I can't give you a passbook status, correct? But the fact is, if you really go and talk to the bankers and ask them, and you really think this through with them, they will give you at least 5 different methods by which that person could have been helped in that instant. Not one. There are 5 different mechanisms. There are other computers which are working. They could have just find out, they can write it on a slip, give it to them. They need not update the passbook because they can perform the task at hand, which is to reassure this old man that his money has arrived. That's what he wants. He doesn't want to take away the money right now. He wants reassurance. It's an emotional need. It's not a technological need. It's not a process problem. It's a problem of human beings. All these are not. Or you take another example. Each of us in this room has gone to several teachers in our life. And by teachers I mean professors, teachers in schools. I'm limiting it to that. All of them have not made a difference in your life, have they? Some of them have. A few of them have profoundly transformed your life. while the rest have walked in and walked out like actors in a show. It wouldn't have mattered if you had replaced them with one or the other. True or not? So few people contributed to your life, the rest merely worked. So this is the challenge at hand. There is a profound difference, major difference in contributing and in working. It's a multi-dimensional problem. It has to do with our emphasis sometimes on process, sometimes it has to do with an emphasis on technology over human beings. Sometimes it has to do with institutional power as compared to the individual in front of you. Sometimes it boils down to plain callousness. Sometimes it comes to a situation where we just don't know that the other person's problem, what is the other person's real problem. We are simply blind to another human being's concern, issues or challenges. Now, how big is a problem in our society of this non-contributorship? Let me share with you a conversation I had with a CEO of a company recently. He's a CEO of a major insurance company. And this gentleman has 10,000 people working for him. And out of these 10,000 people, we're just having a conversation about salespeople, this, that, etc. And he says, you know, frankly, I don't think I have more than 500 real employees. So I said, what are the rest? Don't they get paid? He says, yes, they get paid, but they are not real employees because they come and then they go, they do something. They just somehow, many of them either pass time, or even if they don't pass time, they just do the bare minimum so that I can't sack them. Only 500 of them run this whole company. If you went and talked to at least half a dozen CEOs, the average that will come to you will be in Indian corporations, or 5 to 7% of employees are contributors. The balance are mere workers. When Swamiji said, I want workers, obviously he didn't mean these kind of workers, right? He meant contributors. When he says work for the country, obviously he meant contribute and do something, make a difference to some people. When he says contribute, he says have human concern in every action in addition to technological or social or any other form of concern. That means combine all these into a whole so that you can serve the human beings who come to you. This is a rehumanization of society that Swamiji wanted us from us. Society has been steadily dehumanized, and I'm not saying something new. Very many good and high level commentators have talked about the dehumanization of institutions, systems, technologies, etc. But we are also talking about a rehumanization of society at all levels. And that is, in a sense, the contribution revolution which Swamiji has set into motion. At the highest level, it is the worship of God in man. But at the simplest level, it is simply about being concerned about the human being in front of you and understanding human outcomes besides your process outcomes and besides your other outcomes that you normally anyway meet in your life. So this is the context of our conversation today. We want to examine together two big issues. Firstly, we want to understand how these people who are contributors are profoundly different from others. Because they are different, Let me give you some examples of some great contributors. Recently, I saw an advertisement in the newspaper which talked about 1,50,000, there's a much larger number, I don't remember, number of farmers in Gujarat, all of them pay their humble homage to Mr. Varghese Kuri. He is gone, but there are, on his birthday or on his anniversary, there are so many people who remember him because he has transformed their lives. He has transformed the economic condition of Gujarat and of the milk producers of Gujarat. He has created a company which competes with multinationals. He made India one of the largest milk producers in the world. And who was he when he went to Gujarat? He was just one more government servant who was on transfer, just like there are so many government servants. But he was a man with a difference, right? He was a great contributor. Or you take, for example, Mr. Sridharan. Even after he's retired, everyone is holding on to him. Is it that there are no other Sridharans? Then there is something wrong, no? That man should be allowed. I mean, he is of such a level. He's created one after another great thing, no doubt. But isn't it the other side of the story is that what a tragedy it is that we cannot line up 50 Sridharans after that to say that all these people will do similar things in other cities as Delhi Metro has been done, and just like Konkan Railway, there can be several other railways in this country. What is wrong? Why don't we have such people? Why is it that a few contributors who we come across, we eulogize, we put them on a pedestal, not wrong with that, but what happened to all the rest of us? Where are we in all of this? I presume that when Swamiji talked about men, he meant that all of us also become contributors like this. I presume that he meant that each one of us in this room will take a one challenge somewhere, small one, big one, and transform the country in that one area. So that when you multiply 1, 2, 3, 4, you multiply it around 50, 100 people, then the impact on the country is big. That is what I think he meant when he exhorted us to stand up, to arise and to awake and to stop not till the goal is reached. There is one high goal out there which is realization. But there is also an immediate goal out there which is to build and to contribute to the motherland, right? So if I summarize the challenge that we are trying to face, it is the simple diagram. You see those yellow people out there in the left hand side? They are the number of contributors we have in our country today. And what we need is many, many more contributors. Inside government, inside organizations. There are sweepers. There are thousands of sweepers in the city of Chennai. All of them are not contributors, but some of them are, because we have encountered such people, some humble policemen. So there is nothing to do with education. It has nothing to do with your qualification. You can be from IIT, you can be from MIT, you can be from Harvard, you can be from anywhere you want, but you need not be a contributor because that's a different dimension of your personality. It's not an intellectual dimension. And you can be a sweeper, you can be a simple nurse, you can be a compounder, not a doctor, and yet you can be a very great contributor. And what our country now needs is not more qualified people, but more contributors. We have thousands of engineers coming up. All of them may not be the best, but many of them are good enough for many tasks. But if a proportion of them increased and became contributors, what a revolution there would be in the country. So this is our challenge. And let us slowly work backward from this challenge in terms of asking how are we going to realize this in our individual lives. Because finally all the unit of change is not out there, the unit of change is out here in each one of us, right? So we need to connect that back into our unit of change, which is we ourselves. And we can ask ourselves where we are on the journey of being contributors and how much we need to do in order to become, more like any of these people we were speaking about. So let me begin with the first high-level construction. I decided that it would be okay to be a little abstract in terms of the diagrams today, given the audience. I hope you agree with me. These are two diagrams which describe in a sense what and how of a contributor. The first distinguishing feature of a contributor is an expanded sense of self. Who am I? If you ask that question, if a person's answer to that who am I is oneself in the narrow sense, then the chances of being a contributor are very less. If that person is able to expand his sense of I and say me and my family, that's slightly better. You say me and my my society, my community, my hostel, my whatever, as I go on widening it. From self to the organization that are, when you meet some people, they truly have an organizational identity. They don't have a societal identity. They have an organizational identity. They are far better than others who are merely self-oriented. I don't want to use the word selfish, but I want to use the word self-oriented or self-centered. And then at the highest level, there are people whose starting point, whose sense of self expands to include the whole of society. So the first metric that we need to ask ourselves, if I ask whether I'm a contributor or not, is where am I? If I ask myself who am I, who would I include in my I-ness? Who would I include in my sense of ownness? Who would I include in my identity? How many of us can say I'm an Indian before saying I'm South Indian? And say that I am South Indian before I can say I'm IITian? So what is the order and description of ourselves? If the order of description of ourselves talks at a larger level first, then I think we are on our way to become contributors. Because we will always work hard for that which is ourselves. But if my sense of I, my sense of expansion of my identity is very large, then we are likely to be contributing at least in that zone. That's the first thing. The second question that you need to ask is, how do I operate? At the simplest level, contribution is responsive. When I talked about that banker, it's a responsive situation. Somebody has come to you with some problem. How do I respond to it? Somebody is in need of some help. How do I respond to it? Do I immediately make a difference in that person's life? Can I address the issues that that person faces correctly and deal with it? This is all responsive contribution. But this group here, and that is enough. That is a much higher state of being than what large parts of our government, large parts of our institutional systems are in. So to us, even if we have many, many more responsive contributors, that itself would be a sea change in our country. True, but that is not enough. Take the group which is sitting here. We need to ask ourselves whether we can go beyond responsive contribution to something which I call value contribution. What is a big goal or project that I can take up with which I can make happen? Can I stay with something? Can I apply my will, my intention, my energy, my focus to make at least one larger outcome which impacts a lot of people instead of just responding to a situation? In other words, can I move from being just responsive to a situation to being mission-oriented, goal-oriented, oriented towards some kind of shift or outcome in society? That is the next level. And at the third level, there are some people, and those are the people, those are the Abdul Kalam, those are the Koreans, those are the people who are making transformative contributions. And usually transformative contributions take several years to make. Now, it is left to us how we develop and how do we grow. So these are the two criteria for a contributor. Number one, do I have an expanded sense of self? And number two, am I seeing myself moving from simply responding to the people who come in front of me to proactively taking up goals and proactively taking up missions, and then even further trying to bring about sustainable changes in the world around me. That journey, these things, when they happen, how they happen, they take their own time. But as long as we begin with the sense of, with the journey of expansion and the journey of, increasing the depth of our contribution, then a journey has begun. So this is really the background in which we look at who is a contributor. Now comes the meat of this session. How do we become contributors? What is the journey to becoming contributors? How do we measure it? Not only in ourselves, but in people around us. And what are those steps that you can look out for and do something about? So the first step is shifting from an activity focus to a purpose focus. This is a schema which describes what I am saying, but the examples that I gave you. When you go into a bank and if that person is only looking at rules and routines, that is activity focus, not purpose focus. If somebody throws at you not just the rule book, but simply throws at you constraints, instead of trying to find out what is it and how can I help you or how can I make it happen for you, then that is an activity focus. How do you recognize people with an activity focus? There are several kinds, but there are three kinds that stand out. The first kind that stand out are the duty people. One of the, I must share with you that all this has come out of, of interviewing and meeting and talking to at least several thousand people over the last few years on this, because of the work that we do. But I'll give you some concrete things that happen when you see the duty-bound people. What they will talk about is, this is my duty, and I have to follow my duty. People who talk duty without talking about how it makes a difference to you or how the results are being got is one class of people. They are the most difficult to change. They are the most difficult to handle because they have a halo on their head. They say, see, I'm doing all my jobs very well. I'm doing my duty. But while they are doing their duty, they are not necessarily doing good. They might be doing harm. The most, if I may say, one of the most, in a way, sad and one of the most, blistering examples of duty behavior is an interview that is one person who was sentenced to death after during the Nuremberg trials. You know the Nuremberg trials. After World War II, they held these Nuremberg trials in order to try many of the Nazis who went out and, who sent the Jews to the gas chambers. The person this gentleman, he went to, in the trial when he was speaking, and it made waves in the world when he mentioned that. He said, I haven't done anything wrong. I was just doing my duty, he said. I was following orders. My duty is to my superiors. My duty is to follow rules. So if it meant sending Jews to the gas chamber, I will do it. That's an example of how far off duty can be from contribution. Commentators, I'm no expert, but commentators have spoken about Bhishmacharya and how he spoke about protecting the throne of Hastinapur. And there he was duty bound, but he forgot that the real contribution might have been something else, which is to have prevented that war in the first place by acting differently. That's of course, mythological, and there are many commentators on that, but it's an example of how duty can clash with contribution. So one is this duty bound type of people. All of society is filled with them, and they have other characteristics. They are ethical people. They are not bad people. They are law-abiding citizens. They are good people. They are the kind of people you meet every day among your friends and relatives. They are people who go to work on the right time and they come back at the right time. But they really don't care beyond family. They really are only worried about living that life where they have to make that salary, they get their salary, they look after their children, they bring it up. Within the narrow bounds of duty, they see their life. Swamiji and Swami Vivekananda would be too strong a portion, because it would mean asking some really hard questions. So this is one category of person that you come across. The second category of people are whom we call victims. They constantly complaining, constantly complaining. My boss is not okay, my in-laws are not okay, my job is not okay, my qualification is not okay, everything is not okay. I'm a good person, but guess what? The world is out to get me. Have you heard such people? Victims. Swamiji said, become creators of your destiny, which is the exact opposite of victims. So that's the second category of people. They are filled, organizations are filled with victims. Trust me, you can have an IIT degree and still be a victim. So, that's the second category of people. So you have the duty-bound people, you have the victims, which is number 2. And number 3, there are people who are what I call process-focused, process-obsessed. Now these are people who we find, especially in organizations, in institutions, they are people who like to break everything down into steps which they can control. Simple, clear steps, again and again and again. But those steps don't take into consideration that one random thing in human life, which is a human being. The only random thing is the human being, but all of systems are meant for human beings. So you have extremely well-defined systems which can't handle the random person in front of you. Random because he is reacting. This, by the way, is something that is even more prevalent in the West than in India. India, at least we have the concept of jugaad. So we can do something, we can at least deal with chaos a little. But if you go to the West, you find that they are far more rigid, far more process focused than we can ever be. When you are like that, you can't continue. You can't find solutions to the problems. You can only create problems. Or you can only see deviation and deviances from the norm as problems. If anything deviates from what I have already fixed it to be, then it is not okay. But that is not what is expected of us. No, we have to serve the human being in front of us, and deviations will take place. Recently, just 3 weeks back, a colleague of mine went through a horrifying experience. Her mother was put into a hospital for a test, and the doctor followed the procedure, because of which a vital organ of this lady, old lady, 70 years old, has been ruptured. The uterus has been ruptured, and she's, has to be lifelong disabled. Because the doctor said I was following the strict procedures of that norm, and she was not noticing the dynamics that was taking place in the patient in front of her. Can you believe this? They are highly qualified doctors in one of Bombay's best hospitals. So what I'm talking about are serious challenges in our society. So this purpose focused, how do you bring it back? That is the first step towards contribution. Now what happens if you are purpose focused? At the simplest level, all of us will move from being efficient to being effective. At the simplest level, you will stop complaining. At the simplest level, you will be goal-oriented and you will design solutions instead of creating problems. That itself will make you a pleasure to work with in your organization that you work in. It will automatically make you a valuable resource for an organization. That's the first step towards being a contributor, and that itself is enough to guarantee you a great career. I speak from a different angle, but that is also true. First step is this. Now let's go to the second step. Then comes the next question which is there. What is the quality of my purpose? If you look around, most people's purpose of life is about having, acquiring, taking, having. So they measure life in terms of how much they have acquired. That acquisition may be material acquisition in terms of material goods, it may be knowledge acquisition, it may be any form of acquisition, but it's acquisition, it's have. So that the first or outermost layer is acquisition. That could be the purpose of your life. If that is your purpose, then it is very hard to become a contributor because you are taking instead of contributing. Anybody who is acquisition focused will have to fight his own or her own desires every time he has to contribute. Do you see that? Because your goal of life is to get more, not to give more. There's an inherent flaw then in your whole thinking, right? At the second level, there are some people who are obsessed with doing. They value their activities a lot, which is good. But truly speaking, contributors are those who at some point in time begin to realize that they are on an evolutionary journey themselves. So the first step is to become purpose focused, and the second step is to redefine your purpose from mere acquisition to a level where you say that my goal of life is to evolve as a human being, is to grow as a human being and to start moving is to use every experience, every interaction, every conversation as something that makes me a bigger, wider, larger human being, an evolved human being in whatever way. In a sense, it is a spiritualization of one's life. In a very simple way. Because I don't want to use the word spiritual, at least it will make you an evolutionary person instead of being a frozen person. That would be the second step in the whole journey. If you look around you, you will find that some people, in fact there is a book which talks about mindsets which are beginning to move in this direction. It's by a lady called Carol Dweck from Stanford, and she's written a book called Mindsets. And in that she distinguishes between two kinds of mindsets, fixed mindset and a growth mindset. She says people with a fixed mindset are all the time trying to protect themselves. Their self-esteem does not grow because they are not forcing themselves to face new challenges. They're not facing new circumstances, so they're not expanding the zone of their contribution. So if they're contributing in a very narrow way, they keep doing that, but they don't widen it. But people with a growth mindset are constantly challenging the boundaries of who they are. And the more evolutionary you are, the more you are widening the boundaries of who you are. In which case you also do, and you also have, and nobody's precluding all that, but the main outcome that you are achieving is that becoming, or that evolution as an individual. So that is the second step in the journey of becoming a contributor. Then, once you've done these two, now you're ready for some serious action. That means you are now effective, number one, and number two, you want to evolve. If you're not effective and you don't want to evolve, so evolution is inside, effectiveness is outside. These two start helping each other. The more you can evolve, the more you can become effective also. So it's a dynamic that has begun. Now comes the step 3. Then you ask that what am I doing? Am I just coping with the life I have been given? Or am I creating my own destiny in some real way? As you can see, it is simply what Swamiji is telling us. How much of our life goes in simply managing? We manage our exams, manage our careers, manage our XYZ, because life looks like it's all the time bearing down on us. So we are trying to retain our little spaces of freedom within the midst of life. Nothing wrong with that. But that's only the first step. But in a sense, you are trapped. You are trapped in a structure of expectations. You are trapped in a structure of things which you are expected to do all the time. Can you flip the whole thinking and do something which Swami Vivekananda wanted all of us to do, which is to awaken that heroic dimension? Because if you notice in this diagram, there is that yellow thing inside, that white spot inside that person. Can you seek that awakening of that individual within, of that spark within, that divinity that we talk about, that heroic spirit that we talk about? This is that arise awake moment, where you say, I'm not going to cope, but I'm going to create. I'm going to recreate the circumstances I live in. I'm not going to sit, I'm not going to cope with the India that I am born into. I'm going to create that India. I'm not going to cope with the circumstances around me. I'm not going to cope with dirty roads. I'm not going to cope with inefficient things around me. I'm going to create something out of all of it. Whatever be my zone of creation, whatever way I do it, I'm not going to cope alone. I'm not going to be trapped in the place where others are put. Even worse, there are many people who try to escape this by going from one cage to another, maybe thousands of miles away. So they go from a cage in India to a cage in the US. It's another set of structure or expectations. But standing where you are, can you awaken that which is great within you? The heroic dimension within you. And when that happens, then you are beginning to move into being a contributor. So that is step 3. So let me repeat. Step 1, become effective. Step 2, move from acquisition to saying that no, my goal of life is to evolve. And step 3 after that, awaken that which is great and profound inside you. Awaken the hero within, or the heroic spirit within. Then you reach stage 4, which is that you are making sustainable contributions. And what is sustainable contributions? And this, I think, is very important to this group here. All sustainable contributions might have a functional dimension, but it must have a human dimension. Worldwide, for example, people are beginning to realize that aid agencies are not delivering what they were supposed to deliver. How do I know? I'll give you an example. Just 2 months back, we've had this. I was part of a design session in Europe where one of the world's largest NGOs, we were working with them, and country after country they are saying the same thing. We give them aid, we give them resources, but we find that something is not happening. They keep asking for more. That means it is not enough to give somebody fish, right? Something more has to happen. And that something more is not just capacity, which is teaching people how to fish, but empowerment, enablement. So true contribution is really less about giving people things, and it is about enabling people to find their own answers. If you can work with any group, anywhere, whether a community or even if you are working with your own subordinates tomorrow in a company, the question to be asked is, are you contributing to their life? The answer would be yes, if you are enabling them to become capable of doing the same work themselves. If you can empower them to feel confident to try out something, then you are doing something. As a parent, the same issue, empowerment. As a friend, the same contribution, empowerment, enablement, strength giving of various kinds. Whether it is some form of physical strength might be there, but it's, whether it's intellectual strength, whether it is that inner character strength that you give people the power or the capacity to hold on to their ideals in the midst of, circumstances. You can help in several ways, but all those help if they have ended up in making the person in front of you stronger, more capable, not just in skill terms, but in human terms, in deeper character terms, then you have done something for people. If you are just simply a role model, which inspires many people and gives them strength to be what they are, then that itself is a profound contribution. So to us, at least we have learned that contribution doesn't mean giving, contribution means enabling. Contribution means empowering. Contribution means strengthening. So this is the 4th step in the journey. If I were to go back a little, I'll now walk you through the 4 stages once more. Step 1, do you have a purpose focus? That's your checklist. So you could create a small checklist for yourself. Do I have a purpose focus? Number 1. In everything that I do, or am I just activity oriented? Am I ritualizing life? Or I am trying to ask what is the outcome that I am seeking out of everything? If my life is simply a meaningless set of rituals which I am following, then clearly there is something wrong. I will not be able to contribute. Step 1. Step 2, what is the quality of my purpose? What am I seeking? Am I seeking to have? Am I just seeking to do better work? Or truly am I seeking that evolutionary urge, that this thing which is me, can I expand it in some way? Can I, search for the human possibilities that are sitting within me? Can I awaken those infinite possibilities that are within me, which Swami Vivekananda talked about? Can I search for that vastness which is there within me? Am I just simply somebody so narrow, or is there much more to me? These people, all these people who talk, especially people like Swami Vivekananda, are telling me that there is something much more to me. At least the search, or the beginning of that search, when it takes place, and I'm saying, yes, let me manifest it. Can my work, can my life, can my career be a medium of trying to manifest the possibilities within me? Then that is the second step. And then comes the third step, which is I say, I am not going to cope. I'm going to create. I'm going to transform circumstances rather than simply crib about them or fight about it, or to just simply forbear like millions of our countrymen have done. Part of it is okay. A little forbearance is valuable where you can't do much. But in all parts of our life, one need not be forbearing, right? There has to be at least one zone in your life where one can start becoming a creator. That is the third step. And fourth is, of course, saying that I want to make a sustainable contribution. And that is, I want to strengthen, empower, enable human beings. That is my goal. My job is not, simply at a physical or a knowledge or a resource level in any way. My job is actually a human job. However great a technology is done, I'm actually a person who is empowering other human beings. This is the framework. Now let me kind of close this by asking, by taking it on a slightly different tack for just 2-3 minutes, and ask ourselves that, so does all this lead us to something? And the answer, I think, is yes. I think it's an important second step in the journey to Karma Yoga. Does it have a mouse? Okay. See, Swamiji describes Karma Yoga as a system of ethics and religion intended to attain freedom through unselfishness and by good works. This is a quote from Karma Yoga. Now, this definition really talks about 4 things. The motive for your work. Why are you working? The process through which I work. The outcomes that you are seeking. And finally, what is the frame or personal vision which you have? It is the same 4 things which are in the steps. And if you now go back a little, now you just look at this simple chart here. This is the level at which many people operate, which is the transactional ideal of life. Their motive for work is good for selfishness. Their process is, they say, I will be ethical, I will be a good person, I won't break the law. And their outcome is, I have to attain some form of personal profit, whether it is promotion, pay, prospects, whatever you want to say. And yes, my whole life is really a journey of acquisition, whether acquisition of position, or acquisition of reputation, or acquisition of whatever. This is the life that most of us see around us. There is that high life which actually Swamiji wants us to reach finally, which is where we are unselfish, totally. Where the work, whatever we touch, is good because of our very motive. And where our outcome is attaining freedom, the highest outcome of life. And we see life as a pure journey of spiritual evolution. That is the end state. But what we are now talking about as contributors is to be at least at the intermediate level, where you can look at living at least in enlightened self-interest. One cannot be totally selfless, but one can think win-win. One can at least think not only for one's good, but for the good of others. One need not be egoless, but one can expand one's ego to include others, right? That much is doable within us. And when the process, as we said, is contribution, and the outcomes that we seek, what will you get if you contribute? Actually, the world is hungry for contributors. So you can be dead sure that you will get inner success, at least a little, and at least enough outer success, both you will get. I'm now diluting what I'm saying, at least to make a point that that much is available, and even that much if we reach, we will be on the journey. And if you did that, you would be actually on a journey of inner fulfillment and of the welfare of society. You will have made a difference to yourself, to the world at large. You would be a true citizen of the country. So this is where I hope we all can go. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, they may raise their hand and we'll pass the mic around.
Sir, I go for the first question. So, the first thing you said that means for a contributor, the focus should be the purpose rather than the activity. That is our shift. We should shift our focus from activity focus to purpose focus. But I feel as if the activity focus is as important, even if it is not more than the purpose focus. Because many times you have the purpose, and especially you gave one example of a banker, and the person goes to him and asks him that I want my passbook to be printed. Now, the person who is on the other side of the table, he will have the process in his list that this is the process. If you don't get it like this, then the next step is this, next step is this. He just follows the first one and he simply skips the other four. So even in IIT we see that there are, you go to any department, and especially in Indian context, I feel as if we have some purpose or some ideal and we do not have a methodology, that is the step-by-step breaking up, that if you do this, then you do this. Or for example, suppose I want to help a person. Now, what is my process? I give somebody 10% of my income or something. Some process should be there. So I feel as if the process is also as important as the purpose.
See, first of all, Swamiji is very clear about it. He says that the means and the end are equally important. So at that level, I'm not even fighting. Okay, I'm agreeing. But let's understand this in its context. The 2 points I'm making. Firstly, the context in which I make it, I'm saying that being purpose-focused is the first step of the journey. Because you become effective. And I agree with you that you might be effective in the wrong area or you might be effective in the right area. But it is better to be effective than to be completely ineffectual in life. That's my first point in the whole thing. Because if you're effective, you're at least on your way. You have done something and then you're ready to ask what is my purpose or what is the quality of my purpose I'm chasing. So I'm saying that it's a necessary first step. In a country where you are so hopelessly ineffectual, it is important. Effectiveness itself is an important step for many parts of our country. Point number one. Point number two is I heard this. There's a second aspect to your argument which I've heard several times, which is that what you're telling me to do is to break the rules. No, I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that, and this is an important idea, I'm saying that recognize the freedom spaces that you have despite the rules. What we assume is that rules collapse, or methods or processes collapse all thinking. That's not true. Let me give you the simplest example. You take, say, you take a simple example like talking to a call center. When that person is talking to you in the call center and that person is conversing, you must have, all of us have encountered some call center or the other. You would have phoned up for something. They are all process oriented. But some of them, despite being the process, are able to apply their intelligence there and they are able to connect with you in some way. At least they may reflect concern, they may hear you out fully, they may transfer you to the correct man. Or they might say, take my name, sir, I can do something, or let me find out. They have some mechanism by which they are addressing your problem. While there are yet others who use the same rules to escape from the duty, from the task at hand. They'll say, sorry sir, not possible, keep the phone down. So the rule is the same, but the interpretation of the rule, the application of the rule, the space that you have within the rule is what is lost. And so that space has to be created. And that space is what you're looking for all the time, right? I don't think when you go to a department and ask for help, you're asking them to break the rules. Are you? You're asking them to see the spirit of the law rather than only the letter, right? And you want them to use the law for your good or use the rules for your good and not use the rules to block you, right? So there are several aspects to that rule, is it not? Okay. Yes.
Actually,
No, but- Oh, okay. First here and then.
it's a very silly question, but it's a very answer. The word contributor has, the significance of the word contributor has been seen in the last few years. But going forward, we need the spirit of contribution in every walk of life. So, as we say, charity begins at home. Do you think the word contribution should start from the womb, or we should start at home? The word
What you're saying
contributor
is,
means what the
how do
contributor-
what is the journey of creating a contributive society? Do I begin a contributive society by trying to think of big plans and do big things, or do I begin the journey to a contributive society by doing little acts of goodness and little acts of contribution in my day-to-day life?
Where does it all begin?
I think the answer is that it begins both sides. Because on one side it begins in our personal life in all cases. But beyond that, it also begins that every one of us, or many of us, are given roles of great responsibility. And if we can interpret and use those responsibilities meaningfully, we can achieve a lot. You take, for example, a simple case of school teachers. And you see the same question being asked by Swami Ranganathan in his talk to teachers several decades ago. And he asked the question to them that when I enter the class, can I ask the question, what is my purpose here? Am I here only to simply give them some subject matter, or is my purpose here to awaken and to create future citizens of the country? Once I've shifted the locus, and if I've shifted my purpose, and I said I'm here as a creator of the citizens, there is certainly a great nobility in my role. So by clarifying your purpose, you also clarify that actually all of us have great and noble roles to play. And those noble roles can be played out in society. Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. First of all, the lecture was brilliant. I learned a lot, but I observed particularly two contradictions in your hypothesis.
Okay.
The first contradiction which I observed was you mentioning that the Western world usually has always thought in a unidirectional mode. So suddenly the jugaad, the method of jugaad is almost absent in that world. So at times when you need to use your common sense or presence of mind, they just fail. But if we observe the history of both the civilizations, I cannot really distinguish between both civilizations, but yes, generally, most of the critical thinking has emerged from the West, because in the East,
I've got a question. Can I answer it?
I have a second part as well, but in the East it has always followed the Guru Shishya Parampara. Now, if this is not the case, suppose I'm wrong, and in the East there has been critical thinking as well, then how do we differentiate between ethical and good? You said the lowest level is doing ethical works, then the highest level is doing good works. But isn't good itself a part of that system of ethics? Because who decides what is good and evil? I'm following the words of Nietzsche, a famous philosopher, who said we have to go beyond good and evil. So these two questions,
Okay.
I just...
Let me answer let me answer the two questions separately, because they're two parts, but they're not really. Let me answer them. First part is related to this point about what I made in the West. The fact is that when I am referring to contribution, I am referring to contribution in the mass. I am referring to contribution that you are talking about in the large-scale institutions and systems of society. The fact of the matter is that if you see in the West, for example, there are, and it's a separate, completely different conversation, so I'll just very briefly touch upon it. But it is organized into a small group of people who are extremely, who are given extreme amount of enablement in order to actually design, come out with new ideas, do very many things. And the bulk of many of the systems are really dumbed down. So you have, even in organizations, and I don't want to get into a detailed conversation, even if you see the management models followed by GE and others, they are all focused on a few leaders who can be creative, who can be XYZ, and they assume that the rest of the system have to operate in terms of within the rules so that they can scale it. So now why that happens is a separate matter. So there is really no contradiction. It is true that in the West there are several innovations, several creative activities which have come out, and that coexists with a large scale non-creativity that operates in the large mass of the delivery systems, the McDonaldization side of things. The McDonald's side of the West is as important, or the Walmart side of the West, and the man who's working there is as important as the MIT side of the West. They are two different faces of the same West. That is one part, and if you don't mind, we can have this conversation offline. We are taking us elsewhere. The second part of the conversation is related to the notion of ethics and the notion of good works. Ethical works simply says that you follow good is good to whom? Who is to decide? Good question. But we have given a criteria. Good is that which creates strength in the other person. And I am using Swamiji's definition here. Good is that which empowers the other person, which strengthens the other human being, that makes a lion out of the other person. That is good. And that may be ethical, it may not be ethical, that's a separate matter. But usually, such work will also be deeply ethical. There is no question about it. So ethics is a very narrow frame, and sometimes ethics is defined in, not in, if I may say, it's not defined in independent terms, it is defined in terms of the society in which you operate. For example, you would call Dashratha very ethical, but you would say that, oh, such a person, he had 3 wives, and today how would that look if somebody you knew, if you are, if somebody is some leading politician, or not forget politician, let's talk about others, but if someone had 3 wives, you'll say, oh, that's not valid in our society. So ethics has got a strong societal dimension to it, but when I use the word good, I mean for the good of human beings, the good of the individual, the good of the collective, the good of humanity. So it is for the welfare of that individual that I'm talking about. So there is a clear distinction between the two. Point number 2. Now point number 3. I want to take the battle into your court, which is to ask you one question. There is a profound difference between critical inquiry and contribution. I don't think, and that is my thesis, the critical inquiry has its place, but I think the thing that makes men of us is contribution. Otherwise, we face the fear. I don't say it's a logical consequence, but we face the fear that critical inquiry might make us intellectual, while what we really want to be is to be contributors, to be better men, and to create better men around us, and to serve other men. And that, I think, should be the goal of this conversation. Okay?
No, sir, according to your opinion, how much parents plays a role to make his child a good contributor to his country? How much they play?
I suppose it matters. I haven't thought about this question, what is the ratio of who contributes what to this whole thing. But I suppose if one grows up in an atmosphere of contribution, or in an atmosphere which values contribution, I suppose that one is more likely to be a contributor. While if one comes across people who only value taking, and who value only fattening oneself at the expense of others, then I think that it influences us. And I think that is what is happening in our society to some level. That if you have around us, you have a culture of acquisition, and rather than a culture of contribution, then it naturally affects, especially people who are on the edge, then it needs far more strength, far more bravery, far more conviction to go against the flow. So in that sense, I agree with you that all these influences do have an impact to play. And that is why I think Swamiji, when he spoke 100 years back, I think that the power and the energy needed to be a contributor then was far, far more than the kind of power and energy that we need today. But it still needs a lot. And if we work well enough, then maybe 50 years from now, you know, several generations later, to be a contributor may not be such a big thing. If someone made a presentation, they will say, oh, shut it. Most of us are contributors. Ideally, this presentation should become irrelevant in our society in 10 years, correct? That should be the goal. Yes, please.
Professor. So, Swamiji spoke these words 100 years back, or rather 150 years back, right? But his words are valued in India and abroad, and it is kept on, repeating, right? But the extract of it is not effective. Rather, some single sentences of different contributors have revolutionized the world within 50 or within 25 years. Why so?
Okay. See, I'd like to answer this question at two levels. Okay. First level is that this is my personal theory. There are, but my general theory about this is, and I have thought about this question also. And the first part of the point is that I think that Swami Vivekananda is, in a sense, some form of a meta leader. He creates leaders. So therefore you find Mahatma Gandhi saying that his love for the country went up 1,000-fold. So naturally it is Mahatma Gandhi who is heard by people, not, as much more than Vivekananda, even in our country, at one level. Secondly, you also find similarly Rajgopalji, you find Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, you find so many people. Let me give you another example. If you take Sister Nivedita, for example, and you see her influences, whether on historian Surendranath, or whether you take her influence on Nandlal Bose and on all the artists and on so many people, she impacted, in a sense, so many great leaders in various fields. But she herself, in a sense, was a meta leader. Because though she was Swamiji's disciple, she kind of influenced people who themselves then became leaders, including Jagdish Chandra Bose. She, worked so closely with him. So the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes people like Swami Vivekananda are meant, and I think for people like you and me, if we believe that we want to be those leaders. I think that's the first point, that he is there for the people. And how do these few people actually get inspired and not the rest? Now that comes to the second part. I think that they take the trouble to digest what he says. And I think that if any one of us, each of us, took the trouble of studying Swami Vivekananda, digesting it, arguing with him, reasoning out with him, thinking through with him, applying the tools of critical inquiry with him, and doing all these things with him and truly trying to digest or assimilate what Swami Vivekananda said, I think then people would listen to our words. They would still not listen to Swamiji, but they would listen to us because we are the medium through which he speaks, correct? And each of us is that medium, am I right? So that is my argument, that really Swamiji is creating leaders every day.
Good evening, sir. My question is related to selfishness and unselfishness. Well, I believe the human mind is inherently bent towards thinking of some individual benefit out of every action. So how do you motivate a person, probably a common person, to think apart from himself? And when you motivate the person to think apart from himself and about others, isn't that motivation again going to be something in the form of satisfying a selfish need?
First of all, I'm not fighting with your hypothesis, okay, that we are likely to be self-centered in some way. The question that, if you notice the first thing I said, and look at that term I've used, an expanded sense of self. So I think that the simplest way for us is to widen our sense of identity. Who am I? So Ranganathan uses this term, who am I and what I do. So if I ask the question, who am I, and I expand my question, who am I, then I'm still selfish, correct? But now my selfishness includes within it other people. So the way to be, to actually so I'm not really proposing unselfishness as much as I'm proposing an expanded sense of self. So you say that I includes all these people, and so I'm still selfish, but in my selfishness now everybody is involved, is included, and therefore we are all, everyone's getting benefited. Are you with me? So I am not fighting what you're saying. I'm saying yes, that might be true, but I'm saying the answer lies in expanding. So you say, who am I? If you say this whole organization is mine, the whole IIT is mine, you will think differently. If you say this whole country is mine, you will think differently. So if your primary identity is I am a citizen of this country, I have a feeling that you would respond differently from another person whose primary identity is I am only this narrow individual and I am interested only in this. Is that correct? They both are selfish, but in altogether different ways. Fine?
This is to complement what the young lady asked. A couple of years ago, there was this massive tsunami in Japan, the Fukushima disaster that all of us are aware of. So several people, thousands of people, lost their lives, lost their homes, and it happened in March, so it was pretty cold there. They didn't have electricity and all that. So, large number of citizens in Japan who were not affected by it, they voluntarily underwent penance. They did not eat because they said a large number of our people affected by Fukushima are not eating, they're not getting food, so we'll not eat. So, how is it that this kind of this fellow feeling is the Japanese people are able to bring about, and that kind of complements something that selfishness. How was it that the Japanese are able to overcome this what we probably assume that is a very selfish feeling? But and I was shocked. The West, that my young friend there says is critical. They criticize this fellow feeling, saying that the Japanese should be consuming more because by not eating, they are affecting their economy. So the West took a very critical view of what the Japanese citizens were, showing this empathy for the affected people. They said, no, you should be showing empathy. It is not a good thing. It will affect your economy because your economy will go down if you stop spending. So there is something that is there in the East that is not publicized, but nevertheless, I think there is that feeling.
Yeah, first of all, what's interesting is that Swami Vivekananda himself commented about the patriotic feeling of the Japanese. He makes this comment that they are remarkably, that they've got this remarkable sense of patriotism or sense of citizenship. I'm using the word loosely, but this is inbuilt into that culture already, that their sense of their identity already includes, in the sense of welfare of the nation before welfare of the self. So this diagram itself, would be incorrect in the context of Japan. I think it would begin with society first, organization second, and self third. So it would be reversed in a sense. And so I think that it is I think it is one of our central problems as a society. And even if we got a fraction of what the Japanese did, I think we would be in a far better state. So, I cannot but agree with you, cannot but agree with the idea that we need to expand ourselves. But I'm saying that the only short-term solution is expanding our sense of identity. But the wholesale shift of identity from locus being the self to the locus being the country, I think that will take a much longer time. I think right now the answer can be only an expansion.
I would request you to share two things. How you arrived at this line of thinking. I understand you had a lot of interactions with Revered Swami Ranganathanji Maharaj. First. Secondly, the book which was referred to while introducing you, it's being taught or used in some place in GTU, Gujarat Technical University.
Yes.
That also kindly enlighten us.
Yeah, okay. So, okay, let me share with you that we've been working on this challenge of citizenship, and I must be very, very clear that almost every single major construct or idea that I have or that has gone into this comes directly from Swami Ranganathan. So it's, he almost uses these terms. Like for example, to this whole situation which, you were talking about in Japan, he uses the word imaginative sympathy. He says the ability to feel and to understand that even at a distance somebody else is suffering. It is not that, that suffering, that sympathy that we feel when we see somebody bleeding in front of us. That even the most hard-hearted being, human being, he feels that sympathy when you see somebody, suffering in front of you. But to think of your fellow man suffering thousands of miles away or hundreds of miles away, to feel it, to appreciate it, to understand it, to abstract it and to then act out of it, requires a much deeper and much vaster quality, which he calls, for example, imaginative sympathy. And so he has created all these constructs which are there. What we also, so if I were to describe it in historical terms, the way it has happened is that several years back we began working first with the problem of effectiveness and what we call design thinking, which is now very popular in IDEO and all these Stanford, all these places. They use the word design thinking as a very major idea. And design thinking is really the first step of being purpose oriented. And you find that McKinsey and such consulting organizations today are beginning to talk about purpose as an important idea. So you find that the West has begun talking about the ideas of purpose rather than only activity. It's the first, that's where we had also started out in around 2000. But we went on, looking at the next level. So when we worked with State Bank of India, we worked on the whole problem of trying to build this citizenship culture in State Bank. Now you take a public sector employee, he's say 47, 48, 50, 52. He has got about 5-6 years for retirement. As long as he comes to office and goes home, there's no problem. Nobody's going to sack him or anything like that. There is no incentive for him to contribute. There is no incentive for him to care for the customer. He can just come to work and go home. They have 200,000 such, bankers all over the country. So the chairman was really concerned and he said, how am I going to awaken them to this whole problem? Now, Western models like incentives, high pay doesn't work. In any case, Western management books are beginning to recognize now that incentives have diminishing returns. You give an incentive to somebody the first time, he responds to it. The second time you give the same incentive, he responds less. So the incentives themselves have diminishing returns and they are not able to incentivize people to work more. So these, Western models have severe limitations. And so the chairman of the company was saying that if Western models don't work, if incentives don't work, fear doesn't work. So greed is not working, fear doesn't work, because at 52 he cannot be sacked, and I cannot give him any salary I want being a public sector organizer. How do I make him work? And how do I make him engage with the customer in front of them? That was the problem that they were talking about. The solution that we found in Swami Raghunathan's ideas. We found that you have to use a notion, which in their place we called it, the tree of fulfillment. A very simple idea. We said that the tree of fulfillment has two types of fruits. One set of fruits which you see outside above the ground, and a second set of fruits that you see inside the ground. It's a little bit like that old Ashwatha tree, very different form. There are two types of fruits. The outer fruits are the fruits that you can see around you in the world. Salary, comforts, reputation, name, fame, all these are the outer fruits that you get. And then there are these inner fruits that people get, which is a sense of contentment, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of self-esteem, sense of pride, a sense of strength.
All these are inner fruits which are sitting inside people. The beauty was that when we did these studies, we found that when we did research on the ground, you find that most people can describe the outer fruits, but only feel very vaguely the inner fruits, but cannot describe it. So we then asked them, why don't you try to look at some of your circumstances and experiences of life? This was not done with 1 or 2 people. Finally, it was rolled out to 200,000 people and tested out with that many people. Time and again they found that the most valuable, the most fulfilling, the most beautiful moments of their life were those where they received inner fruits and not where they received outer fruits. And that by describing those inner fruits, they were getting something. And those inner fruits came only when they contributed. So that was the line of thinking. So from there we realized that there is something which leads to those inner fruits, and those inner fruits or fulfillment comes only when you contribute and not when you merely work. So that is the background. The second part of the question is, are we doing this? Just for your information, we are running a program in Gujarat with Gujarat Technological University, and that's what Maharaj is referring to, where we have created a textbook and a 48-hour course around it. And every single engineer passing out of Gujarat for the last 3 years has gone through the program where they have been exposed to these ideas of contribution. We don't believe all of them have changed because of it, but at least a significant proportion of them have mentioned after that it has shaped their understanding of why they work or what they should expect when they go to work. And that program today has now reached 300,000 people. And recently, a German university from Saarland has agreed to collaborate to study this phenomena, this whole thing. And they want to study it and publish it in European journals to show what it might mean if they can bring in this contribution thinking into Europe. So this is because they realize that the same thinking is needed in places like in Italy. There is 52% unemployment and 48% unemployment in Spain. So you're really talking about serious problems in the West.
We'll take 2 last questions.
Right. Yeah, the last 2 questions.
Okay. My question is regarding from where should we derive our purpose? Because we have different sources like deriving it from our constitution or deriving it from our religion or or deriving it from our scientific temperament. So the first question is about where should we derive our purpose from? And the second one is like there's a premise that good is the enemy of great. So if we are settling in for say contribution ideal, are we not enemy or are we not limiting ourselves from the Karma Yoga ideal?
Okay, let me answer the 2 questions sequentially. The first question, the answer is that all this will to change, etc. comes, I don't think it is so important whether it comes from religion or science or anywhere. I think it is important, and our understanding it comes from an ideal. If you have a scientist and he has a great ideal, then the scientist's ideal will drive him. If you have a religious person who's living by an ideal, then the ideal will drive him. So I think that the essence that we are really talking about is creating an ideal for oneself, and that is the motive force, which is I think your question. Am I correct? The motive force or the frame from which you should come is not religion or science or philosophy. I think it is the ideal that you choose to live in. And you may create your own ideal as a consequence of something that you came across in literature or in philosophy or elsewhere, or it could come from a great soul, it could come from a role model, it could come from anywhere. But I think that the motive is always an ideal for living that. That's the first point. And the second point is, what you are saying is, can an ideal become limiting? And the answer is yes. An ideal can be limiting. Sometimes people have very narrow ideals, and those ideals actually end up with good becoming the enemy of the great. So it is important that any ideal that we choose must be what I call an evolutionary ideal. That means it should be an ideal that demands from you greater and greater strivings rather than an ideal that allows you to be happy with what you have. So to that extent, I think that if one contributed or was a contributor without having that evolutionary vision of oneself, that is, if you don't see yourself as or being on an evolutionary journey, and you just saw yourself as a do-gooder, then I think that that contribution ideal that derives from, or a contribution that derives from being a do-gooder, I think will be self-limiting. While if you say that my contribution comes from my own journey to the infinite, it is only then that it will be effective in the long run. So I think that while we are looking at the contribution ideal, you should not lose sight of the Karma Yoga ideal. You should only see it as a step along the way. You should not see it as an end in itself. So I agree with you. It should be treated nearly as much like that. But this is a journey of many lifetimes, isn't it? Yes.
Referring to your inner roots, what we are mentioning, the main problem probably with these issues is that one cannot identify what are these inner roots. So what do you think we should do to awaken people, or what you have done probably in your experiments? What did you do to actually awaken their, to understand what are their inner roots, how to realize them?
The analog is, when we go to, there is this, you must be aware that these people, these Eskimos, for example, know apparently 50 different types of snow. While for us, snow is only one big thing. So we face the same problem, that unless we come a little closer, we cannot distinguish between these various kinds of fruits which are there. But one thing that we found very useful is that you have to give people, and there is a little bit of coaching and a little bit of mentoring that sometimes helps, that when people become conscious, either through talks like this or through their own experiments or through their conversation, where they don't ignore what they feel or what that sense of strength that they get, or the sense of that sense of deep empowerment that they get, or the sense of expanded sense of self that they get, the sense of universality. These universal ideas, when they reveal themselves even for an instant, I think the hard work is in holding on to those instants a little more. When we have done it by giving people conscious knowledge about it. But is there a way to do it in a day-to-day life? I don't know. I don't know the right answer right now. Maybe it might be through more reading, or by the company of holy men, and through such like activities perhaps. But I'm not so sure it can be done without conscious knowledge or through one of these two methods. I don't have a formula that can be applied without one of these two. Not yet. But thanks. Let me start working on it. Yes. I thought, okay, yeah. Last one or?
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you that, okay, now your words were quite provoking, thought-provoking. Now when we get out of this lecture hall, we start our everyday work, what happens is we are surrounded by a situation where we are constantly, there is, we can say, what I want to say is, how do we keep ourselves motivated through this? Because once we go out of this hall and start doing everyday work, we will be surrounded by competition and all those things. And then what happens is you will be prone to think self-centered. So how do we keep ourselves motivated in thinking in more generalized or in enlarging your sense of things?
Let me give you a story which will explain this. Many years back, about 5 years back, I had a meeting with the CEO of an insurance company, not an insurance, of a mutual fund company. That gentleman, I was talking to him and I told him about this idea of, trying to see the outcome behind anything. So he said, if you're doing something, I said, what outcome are you trying to achieve? Why am I doing that, and what is the end state? Where am I headed with it? And I asked him that question, and we did 2 days of consulting around something like that. I met him 5 years later. And in fact, 5 years later, he approached us and he says, can you help me with my entire organization? He says, now I have left that company and joined another one. He said that at one conversation which we had, I started applying that thought of what is the goal or what is the purpose or what is the outcome that I need to achieve in everything that I did. He says, as I started doing it, it revolutionized my entire thinking over the next 2 years, to the extent that I achieved a lot of success, and that is how I am now a CEO of a much larger company. And not only that, he must have mentioned this story to at least half a dozen people, whoever he meets, saying that this is how I was helped with this one line. So I think it is in the hands of, it's in our own hands if we choose to take up this statement. Just like Ramana Maharishi talks about who am I think that to become a contributor, the one question you can keep asking is what is the purpose of why I am doing this? It's a very disconcerting question, very hard question, and you may come out with very uncomfortable answers. But the more you practice that question, I think that it will get you somewhere very, very farther down the line. It will help you break through the clutter of life. I think that's the formula.
I think maybe what they are saying is, I think you also went through the IIT system. What they are saying, anyway there is a relative grading which you call it RG. So that directly works against it. They say, anyway I have to go to the hostel quiz, I have to outperform the others. I think that's what they are trying to say.
Right.
How do we keep these ideas afresh and sustain them?
Okay, that's a different question. So he's asking, how do I keep the ideal alive?
Yes. Because anyway, when I go back tomorrow, there's a quiz I have to do.
I thought he was asking, how do I practice this in the midst of life? Okay, if you want to practice it, then this is the way. But if you want to keep the ideal alive, then the answer is very simple. I think Swamiji's works. I think that every day that you read it, every word that you read, and even if it falls like driblets, I think it will transform. I don't know of any better formula, honestly. At least that's what has worked with me. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.